The early spring can be one of the toughest times to consistently go out and chase big smallmouth bass and put fish in the boat. So in today's video, we're going to break down their movements, some baits that you can use, and ways that you guys can go out and simplify your process to consistently put smallmouth in the boat this spring. Stay tuned.
Staring at those city lights, had some ugly days to get some pretty nights. Cut some people off, dreams take a sacrifice. Yeah, they wanna make it, but can never pay the price.
What is going on, everyone? My name is Benjamin Nowak with the Smallmouth Experience. In today's video, we're going to be talking about early spring smallmouth bass fishing. And for a long time, this was a really tough time of year for me to go out and consistently catch fish. And a lot of that had to do with how well I was catching those fish in the late fall. I basically was catching those fish right up until there was ice on the lake. So I would take my spring and I would go back to those same areas and struggle to get bit. But today we're going to go over smallmouth bass movements and why that wasn't the right process, and ways that you guys can take some new information from a changing perspective and go chase some fish. But first, I'm going to call my buddy Alex, Dirds, and Ron. We're going to basically get a little bit of information that might make more sense here in just a second. Okay, so here's my question for you, man. After a long winter, when it's miserably cold outside, what do you do the first day that you get some nice weather? When it's warm out?
Fishing.
You go fishing, right? You go outside? Okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thanks, buddy.
Right around. I do this every single year. No f***ing joke. Is I usually take the dog out for a drive. We roll the windows down, and we listen to California by Wiz Khalifa.
Okay.
It goes, I just want to ride in my ride with the top down.
So you basically just go outside. You just go outside and enjoy the warm weather finally.
I do.
Probably take the boat out and do something.
So basically just go outside and enjoy the warm weather finally.
Yeah, I would say so. More than likely, yeah. Just enjoy it.
And then when it gets cold again, what are you doing?
Probably just bitching.
Sitting back inside and being lazy?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I feel that. I know you guys are probably saying to yourselves, what do those phone calls have to do anything with smallmouth bass movement? And the point I was trying to get across is that after a long, cold winter, these fish were hunkered down inside their homes all winter long, just like humans. When we get those first couple really warm days, really nice weather days, we want to go outside. We want to get into that warmth. We really want to enjoy that first bit of warm weather. Smallmouth are exactly the same. They want to push up into the shallows, push into that warmer water. A lot of times it's dirty, it's muddy, there's rain, there's snow melt off. There's a lot of factors that are going to cause that water to warm up faster. So they're going to push up into that warmer weather conditions. But as we all know, early spring water fluctuates a ton, right? You're going to have those cold days, you're going to have snow. So these fish have to be close to that deeper water, close to their home, to be able to retreat back to that home or that more stable, consistent water if we do get that nasty weather. So think of it as humans. When you get warm weather, you like to go outside. When you get cold weather, you want to go back to your house, a stable, really consistent weather. It'll make more sense as we dive into it. We're going to cover lakes, like the Great Lakes. We're going to cover reservoirs, and we're going to cover glacial style bodies of water and how these fish move in accordance with those weather changes throughout the early spring. As we start to look at these different styles of bodies of water, one thing I want to point out is what is the true definition of early spring fishing. For me, that is when that water temp is below 48 degrees. Once you get to that 48 degree mark, you start looking at pre-spawn, you start looking at fish starting to get ready to feed up and move up into the flats or move up into the shallow bays where these fish want to start spawning. But less than 48 degrees is what I consider early spring fishing. The water temps are really cold. Those fish are really keyed in on bait fish. They're looking to kind of feed up and get warm from the winter, but I wouldn't consider it pre-spawn fishing until that water temp hits 48 degrees. So keep that in mind as we start to look at these different bodies of water. So the first style body of water I want to talk about is a natural lake, and this is Lake St Clair, in particular the Mile Roads. And I chose this location because of how it sets up, but also because it's probably one of the most productive early spring areas maybe in the country. There will be hundreds and hundreds of boats out there, and everyone will be catching fish, and the reason for that is the fish population, but also because of how the lake sets up so perfectly to draw so many fish into such a small area. So just a little key for you guys. This blue is the edge of the lake. These black lines are contour lines, and then you have the water depth, 6, 9, 15 foot, and 22 foot. Then you have black slashes, this is basically where there is some sort of harder bottom. And these are going to illustrate the fish movements, as well as these little green fishes on here. One thing I want to touch on is what I used to do, what I used to focus on during this time of year was going out to this really deep water, this 22 to 26 foot of water, 30 foot of water, where I was catching those fish in the fall. I would be way out here, and while I do think there is a class of fish that's always in that deep area early spring, I think it's very difficult to catch those fish. The reason for that is they're grouped up on such tiny areas that it makes it really hard to find those fish unless you have them pinpointed to a T. So unless you have those fish dialed very, very specifically, it can be extremely tough. But you can catch groups of fish out here. The most effective areas, the most consistent areas that I found are going to be in this 15 foot to the 9 foot or 15 to 12 foot change in bottom contour. You're looking for a very hard drop from, you know, that 9 to 12 foot of water down into that little bit deeper, more stable water conditions, because this water is going to warm up faster. It's also going to cool down a lot faster. The 6 to 9 foot is going to cool down and warm up a lot faster than that deeper, more consistent 12 to 15 foot of water. So a lot of times my focus this time of year is 9 to 15 foot of water, and that's a relatively big area, but when you think of it as you're not fishing that whole flat, you're not fishing the whole 9 foot flat, you're fishing closer to the break on that 9 to 15 foot of water, or specific contours on that change. One thing I want to focus on is that a lot of times early spring, these fish are still going to be hanging out off the drop. They're still going to be hanging out kind of right in that deeper water, looking to push up to the shallows, right? They're going to want to be pushing up into the shallower, warmer water. So they're going to be hanging out on little points, little inside turns, which is essentially, if you have a point, where it comes in and cuts back. This would be an inside turn, this would be an inside turn. They're going to be hanging out on these contour changes on that deeper water contour line. You're going to have these fish relatively stacked up, but when you get those warm weather days, what these fish are going to do is they're essentially going to pull up into that 9 to 12 foot of water. This is an area where you can catch those fish with moving bait. And when these fish are pushed up on those flats, that's really when they're aggressive. That's when I tend to catch the most fish. And the reason for that is they're looking to feed. They're coming up because that water's warmer. Once they push up onto the flats, once they commit to getting up onto the flats, a lot of times I'm going to be looking for bottom composition changes, areas where those bait fish can hang out, whether that's sand to grass, whether that's sand to rock transition, something different along the bottom, because a lot of times a flat will be made up of one specific type of bottom. Look for where it transitions, look for where it changes or is abnormal, because a lot of times that's where those bait fish are going to be pushed up on, and that's where those smallmouth are going to be up there feeding. These fish on these flats are all about the bait fish, so you're going to be looking for those bait fish, and a lot of times those bait fish are going to be hanging around the bottom composition changes up here on the flats. So the next style body of water that we're going to take a look at is a reservoir, which is a dammed off river system. So just like Lake St Clair, what you have, the blue is the outline of the body of water, the black is actually the river channel, and the arrows are showing the direction that is pointing, which in this case is down. The green are the fish, and the red are hard bottom or debris deposit areas, which will make more sense here in a second. And one of the constants in all of these styles of bodies of water is that smallmouth want to have deep water access. They want to have quick access to go back to deep water if the weather changes really quickly, and they want to be around bait fish. But what's going to position these fish is actually going to be current swings or current and channel swings, and that's typically where these fish are going to set up. So if you take a look at my drawing here, a lot of the areas where the green are along hard contour changes. Just like when I showed you guys Lake St Clair, they're around points, they're around hard channel swings, and the reason for that is that's where it's going to be easiest for these fish to live their life. On these channel swings, on these current breaks, it's going to be more slack water. These fish can just kind of hang out, relax in that warmer water, and a lot of times that's where you're going to have your debris deposits. That's where your leaves are going to get caught. That's where things are going to get caught in shallower water, including bait, and that's why these areas are so productive. Now, if you look up the river here, one thing you're going to notice, especially in the tight portion of the river, is that these fish are either going to be oriented to little changes on the actual river channel, small contour changes on the river channel, whether that's a rock pile, whether that's a small contour change where it kind of stops flowing there as quickly, if that's where fish are going to be positioned, or again on a hard contour or structure change, which here is a little point. There's a flat with some debris on it, and that's where these fish are hanging out because it's basically an easy area for bait fish to swim by and them to come out and ambush it. It's all current related, so if you don't have the current, these fish are going to be scattered, but as there's heavier current, you're going to notice them position along these channel swings, along these contours a lot more effectively. So when you think of a river system, think of bait fish, think of current oriented, whether that's along points or along contour changes or channel swings. Just keep these tricks in mind and you're going to catch more smallmouth. So the final style body of water is the easiest to explain, hardest to actually consistently catch fish on for me, and that is a glacial style body of water. Now, if you look at this, super simple design. It's typically just a big style bowl with a relatively large flat section and a very large deep water section where there's a hard contour change. You have a little bit of contour change, maybe a point, maybe a little inside turn on the lake where I have some green X's, but for the most part there's not a whole lot of change on the lake. What's interesting about these styles of bodies of water is if you watch some of my older videos, when I fish glacial bodies of water, I key in on bottom composition changes, and that can be extremely important, but a lot of times that's way up on the flats. So early spring, I'm staying off of the break, I'm staying along that hard first break, and a lot of times these fish are either suspended or right up on top of the flat. The areas that are going to be most productive, the areas you're going to really want to key in on are small contour changes across the lake, whether, like I mentioned, that's an inside turn or a small point that comes out. That's what's going to congregate these fish in the bait fish, because most of the lake is relatively featureless. It's just a big bowl, so these fish can kind of roam wherever they want. So the most consistent productive areas are going to be small contour changes, whether it's a point, inside turn, or just, relatively minute contour changes around the bowl style body of water. For the most part, early spring, I'm sitting off the break. I'm sitting in that little bit deeper water, sometimes up into 50 foot of water, but I'm casting up just to the flat, bringing it off that flat where these fish are sitting, hanging out. Because in the early spring, they're not going to be way up on the flat, feeding in 4 foot of water. A lot of times they're going to be suspended over that break, feeding on bait fish that just seem to swim by. So the most consistent way to fish a glacial style body of water is sit in this deeper water out here, cast or parallel a flat around high percentage areas, contour changes, and that's where you're going to get most of your bites. So now let's start talking about baits and ways that you can approach these styles of bodies of water to catch fish. So one thing I'm going to focus on when I talk about baits, rather than brand or color, is the style of bait and the approach that I'm taking with these baits to trigger these fish to bite. Now, my approach with my bait selection is relatively simple. I want something that's either going to go to mid-column or deeper. A lot of these fish are going to be closer to the bottom. They might be willing to come up for a jerk bait or a swim bait, but for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on that lower half of the water column. So if I'm fishing in that 9 to 15 foot of water, I want something that goes, 6 to 15 foot of water. I want something that's going to be in that deeper part of the water column. And that's really going to be my magic depth. I've mentioned it a little bit before, but 9 to 15 foot is where I'm going to be really focusing this time of year. Now for soft baits, what I'm going to be throwing are small style finesse swim baits. You have your Kitek Easy Shiners, your Mega Bass Spark Shads, but small style swim baits. Swim baits that have a really tight body, a tight action coming through the water. Just something that I can keep low and slow through the water. Swim baits is a really effective tool that allows you to cover water effectively, but you can also reel it very slowly and slow it down and pick apart an area as well with the swim bait. I'm also going to go to a Ned rig or a tube. A tube is a killer for smallmouth, but a Ned rig is a super finesse way to get a bunch of bites. So if you just want to pick apart an area by dragging a bait, a Ned rig or a tube is going to be a really great option. Now as we get into hard baits, one of my go-tos is going to be a lipless crankbait, and the reason for this is basically its versatility. A lipless crankbait is something I can fish whether I'm fishing a glacial style body of water, a natural style body of water, or a reservoir, and I can fish it a variety of different depths with a variety of retrieves, whether I'm flopping a trap, which is something I did a bunch last spring, or if I'm burning it mid-column, a lipless crankbait is going to be a really effective tool to draw fish from a long ways. One of my favorite retrieves is just dragging that thing or slowly hopping it, almost like I'd fish a blade bait, and it just gets a lot of bites from me that way. The next style bait that I want to talk about is a small body crankbait, and this is something that Alex Rudd does a ton of. But a small body crankbait is a great way to get bites because you can cover so much water and be so effective with it. So a lot of times, rather than throwing a big wobbling style body, this is a Berkeley Fritz side. It's a flat-sided crankbait or a flat-sided square bill, depending on how deep I'm fishing. I just want something that's going to have a relatively tight wobble that I can cover a lot of water with, especially when I'm in that shallower water situation, you know, that 9 foot of water. A small body crankbait is going to be a great way to cover water and find fish very, very effectively. And as I mentioned, a jerkbait is something that you can't overlook, but in particular, I like a deeper diving jerkbait in the spring. In that early spring water, again, I want to get this bait deeper in the water column. So what I'm going to be throwing are baits that dive deeper. This is a Rapala Shadow Wrap, and it is a deep model, so it dives to about 6 or 8 foot of water, depending on what size line you throw it on. Another really good one, I don't even know if this is made anymore, 6 cents Provoke 106XDD. It's a deep diving model from 6 cents or Megabass. There's just so many good deep diving jerkbaits out there. But what's so effective about a jerkbait is the suspend on the bait. So when you're fishing this bait, you're going to want to make a long cast with it, get it down there, and allow that bait to kind of suspend and hang out a little bit. And a lot of times those fish can key in on it, come up to it, and they'll tag it when you go to jerk it again. So don't be afraid to let that bait sit there, but with smallmouth, you can work it more aggressively. So a jerkbait's a really fun way to catch a lot of big fish in the spring. So that right there is how I break down a variety of different styles of bodies of water. Focus on that mid-depth, that 9 to 15 foot range. Don't make the same mistake I did and try to go to their wintering holes way away from that shallow water, because I don't want you guys to be as unsuccessful as I was for as long as I was. So use some of these techniques, use some of this information, some of these baits, and some of these approaches, and I promise you guys will have more success in the early spring chasing big smallmouth bass. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Share it with your friends. If you're not already, please hit subscribe to this channel. Again, my name is Benjamin Nowak with the Smallmouth Experience. And as always, take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue passion.